So good morning, everybody. For those that don't know me, I'm Ryan Young, and I serve as one of the fractional CIOs here at the Fulcrum Group. Which just means that I act as the Chief Information Officer for all of the full managed spot clients that we have at the Fulcrum Group. And My specialty is in local government. So I have the privilege and the challenge of supporting all of our local government clients and all the unique challenges that come with that. So I know some of you deal with me directly. I'm actually working with you today. Some of you dearly departed have moved on to other roles where I don't get to work with you anymore, but it's great to see you come back to meetings like this. So I guess we can move to the next slide.
Let me get that. Could do that easily. Here we go.
All right. So the agenda for today. So we'll talk a little bit about CGIS, what that is, and why it's the 500-pound gorilla that we have to face anytime we have a public safety department within our organization. We'll move on to the some things specifically about the Texas Public Information Act around email archiving and other types of media, and whether or not we have to archive those things and how we might do that. We'll talk a little bit about credit card processing and the PCI compliance that comes with that, and then touch on HIPAA a little bit, which even if you're not in healthcare, if you have employees, you care about HIPAA. So we'll talk briefly about that at the end here. So what is CGIS? I would ask if anybody can tell me what the acronym stands for, but it's written there on the screen. So that's a little bit of a cheat code there. But so anybody who's ever dealt with law enforcement should know the term CGIS, or you've at least heard it mentioned, even if you don't, maybe you work at staff at town hall or city hall and don't really touch anything with the PD. You probably still heard some discussion around CGIS. It is a pretty big deal. And the main thing I've learned about it when it comes to compliance and designing a network and supporting an IT infrastructure for an organization is that if you touch CGIS in any way, if you have a CGIS system that you interface with in your public safety department, you pretty much have to use that as the standard for everything else that you do on the network. I've sat in CGIS audits and asked specific questions that were on the audit about, okay, are you asking me about the CGIS system on the network, or are you asking me about the whole network? And the answer was yes, both. And so it's really just best practice to use the CGIS standards to design your whole network and to protect your data, because really all you're doing is just setting a higher standard for everything else. So there's really no downside to it other than just the work that it takes to get there, and then sometimes the financial expenditure that's required to get yourself there. So a lot of agencies, especially with smaller organizations and departments, they tend to borrow or piggyback off somebody else's system. So they might go with maybe a local county. In some cases, there could be an agency somewhere else in Texas that offers up their CGIS system. So there's a number of different ways to do that. And some of the unique challenges there are if you're borrowing somebody else's CGIS system, then you've got to be compliant with whatever their standard is. So part of my job, I'm dealing with this at a couple agencies I support now, is helping make sure that we're compliant with whatever the standard is of that providing organization. Guess we'll move on to the next one. So let's talk a little bit about CGIS audits. So the Texas Department of Public Safety is responsible for conducting the audit. They're supposed to do them every 3 years. I don't know how realistic that is, especially with the lack of manpower that at least I'm aware of out there, but that's what the standard that they're supposed to hold themselves to. And it is really about showing proof that you're compliant with the policies. And so the latest version of the policy was published in December of 2024. I saw some mention in the chat there about getting rid of that other role and having those 18 unique designations. So yeah, that's a lot of fun trying to figure out who's going to do that. I'm guessing most departments are probably just going to put one name for all 18 of those, but if that's allowable. But usually the audit looks something like before the auditor shows up on site, they send you some questionnaires, they send you some example policies. You have to fill out the questionnaire and you send it back to them to do the pre-work. And then the auditor usually comes on site and you spend the better part of a day going back through your responses to the questions, clarifying some things, documenting some things. And at the end of it, you get a list of action items for anything that you're not compatible or not compliant with. And you have to show proof of that you have a plan in good faith to remedy those things. Otherwise, you risk having your department shut down, which has happened before. So um, it's glad to hear that it was similar to your experience, Patrick. So it is. It's pretty labor intensive. It is very tedious, and it can especially be overwhelming for people. Smaller departments don't have the resources of, say, a big city. So they've got police officers, and usually, somebody like a sergeant gets stuck with having to deal with a CJIS audit, and they may not be an IT expert. So that's where somebody like me needs to be sitting in the room with you to help understand some of the technical jargon. They use some pretty interesting language in the CJIS policy and kind of tiptoe around certain things because they don't want to call out, specific products or specific companies or brand names. They have to be pretty careful with how they refer to things. So it can be a little overwhelming, but if you just break it down and, eat the elephant one bite at a time, you can get through it. Next slide.
All right.
So a lot of information on this page, but some of the major changes from the version 6 of the policy. They're trying to get up to speed with some of the more advanced cybersecurity features and requirements that David touched on in the last presentation. But then a lot of it is around formal documentation as well. So they've drawn the line in the sand when it comes to multi-factor authentication. So you've got to have that in place. You've got to be protecting all of those required systems for that. You now have to have a documented incident response plan on file with them. If you're not sure what an incident response plan is, that is just like it sounds. It is a document. Switch slides on me, Dave.
Sorry.
It's all right, but that's a document that you would have in place that literally lays out what everybody's roles and responsibilities are and what the protocol is for if you do have some sort of a cybersecurity incident. So that incident could be everything from somebody got physical access to a restricted area that they shouldn't have been in, or it could be like a cyber breach that somebody got access to your network, that got behind your firewall, they got access to your Microsoft 365 environment. And so there's that document. What that's intended to do is to write everything down of, okay, if this happens, God forbid, this is what everybody's going to do and who's responsible for doing what. There are templates available. I would recommend for anybody who's part of the Texas Municipal League, they do have some templates to get you started. And then there are also the federal organizations that have some templates that you can take advantage of that are usually based on NIST or the CIS, different organizations that have templates out there that you can start with. So you don't have to write it from scratch, which is helpful. But there's been a lot of elevated and stricter standards when it comes to access controls for users. So for example, many of you may have had some experience with somebody like a sergeant or a captain or a chief coming to you and saying something like, hey, I need administrator access on our network, and I need you to make sure that I have that because I don't want to have to call a service desk or wait in the event that I need to install a new application or, whatever the case may be. And typically because those people have high levels of authority, historically, we've honored that request, but they're really starting to crack down on that just because somebody's in that role doesn't mean that they need to have, say, global admin access to the entire network. So it's really about what is using the principle of least privilege, what is the minimum amount of access that we can give to that user to accomplish what it is that they need to do. And make sure that, in some cases, maybe even create a separate administrator account for that user to use. So that would be separate from their day-to-day operations. So they don't need a global admin account just to log in and check their email. Maybe they need a separate admin account with a extremely long and complex password that they use for those special occasions when they need to, override and provide some sort of local admin access, for example. Data encryption, got to make sure that, data at rest is encrypted, especially when it comes to backups. That's one thing that usually comes up is you got to make sure that that data is being encrypted up to a certain standard. And then you've got to be doing regular security assessments as well. There are third parties that can help you with that. And then make sure that you have the cybersecurity monitoring, which it talks about. Some of you may have heard of the term SIEM, SIEM. The CGIS policy doesn't specifically call out SIEM, saying that you need that, but it does call for, I wrote it down to make sure I get the terminology right here. Back. It does call for the monitoring, reporting, and forensic data that you need to capture on your network, which is what a SIEM typically does. The good news is that SIEM, those types of solutions have historically been extremely expensive to buy the hardware that's required. And so there have been some breakthroughs and some new things that have come to market that have made that functionality much more affordable in the form of SOC MDR type services. So that will also get you compliant with the CGIS policy, and that those offer, syslogs, FIM logs, and various other things that can get you compliant with that. So that's the good news there, is that it's much more affordable than it used to be. Another new thing we've recently learned is that for if you have any sort of remote access tools, so if you have a third party like Fulcrum that can log into your computer and help you whenever you have a problem, so they can see your screen, they can provide password credentials, whatever the case may be. A lot of those tools are by default set up to where your IT department or your IT provider can access your computer without your consent. Now, they don't know your password, but if they happen to log into your computer at any given point, you might have something on your screen that could be sensitive information. In particular, if we're talking about law enforcement, we could be talking about evidence files or videos or something that we don't want just anybody seeing. And so it's incumbent on, if you have those remote access tools on your system, you have to configure them in such a way that before anybody else can log in and see another person's screen on that system, there has to be a pop-up window that says, hey, somebody's trying to access your computer. Is this okay with you? And you have to click the OK or the yes button to let that person in. So that's a new change that they've got in place. So servers are exempted from that policy just because they don't usually have sensitive data on there on the screen at all times, and your IT staff needs to be able to get to those things after hours when nobody's there for patching and whatnot. So they do exempt those, but for an end user workstation, they do have to provide that consent now. Jump to the next one there. A lot of information on this slide, so I'll try not to just talk about every single one of them, but hit some of the key points here. Obviously, if anything jumps off the page at you and you want to go a little bit deeper, please ask. So really, the first thing you got to do is just make sure that you know what the minimum required policies are. So you got to understand what's in the CGIS security policy, understand what those standards are, and make sure that you're implementing those things across your entire organization, not just in public safety. So if you don't know what they are, or if you need help understanding them, that's where somebody like Fulcrum or myself can come in and help you, or even the DPS officer can sometimes help train as well. Especially they're usually pretty forgiving if it's your first audit that you've been through. They kind of look at that as some training ground to really teach you about what the CGIS policy is and help you find where the gaps are. When it comes to third parties, they've also become a little bit more strict. So if you have a third party like Fulcrum that you provide access to, or if you have any sort of a private contractor who gets access to your systems, you do have to have the documentation in place for those users, and they do have to be fingerprinted and background checked. And that information does need to be in the fact clearinghouse. So just because somebody in your third party, they may have their fingerprints on file and they may use a fingerprinting service, say when they hire a new user, but that doesn't mean that that necessarily is making its way into the fact clearinghouse, which is a requirement of CGIS policy. So you might want to double check that all of your staff, all of your third parties do have that system in place to where, for example, if one of the third parties that you use, if one of their service desk guys gets arrested for a particular type of crime, that may make it to where they are no longer eligible to access a CGIS protected system. And the fact clearinghouse will give the department in question, it will give them an alert about that. And so they can take action and make sure that that person gets cut off from accessing their system. The other big thing is that for every private contractor or third party you have that's accessing your system, there must be a security addendum on file. So you have to have the security addendum on file in your systems. And then every employee, so for example, with Fulcrum Group, all of our employees have to sign a page as part of that security addendum, and we have to have that on file and provide that to the departments we work with to make sure that we're compliant with that policy. So FIPS compliance, that's another fancy acronym that you hear a lot about. And it's one thing to have a firewall that says it's FIPS compliant. So you can, that's readily available. The manufacturer, SonicWall, WatchGuard, Fortinet, whoever the case may be, they will all have those certifications on file. So it's one thing to know that it's compliant. It's another thing to actually have that turned on in the firewall settings themselves. You do have to go put it into FIPS mode. And when you try to turn it on, the first thing the firewall is going to do is give you a list of all the things that you need to change in order to be compliant with FIPS, things that it may or may not be able to turn on right away without breaking stuff. So it's not just as simple as flipping the switch. It usually requires some pretty advanced network maintenance from a senior engineer in order to be able to cross over that threshold and make sure that you're compliant in that way. Another thing I'll call out on this screen is network segmentation. So you want to do your best to logically and physically separate the public safety network from anybody else. So especially with smaller municipalities, oftentimes the police department and the city staff or town staff might be under the same roof in the same building. So it's important to try to physically and logically separate the PD from everybody else, just to further segment them and protect them from attack. And any SSIDs. So an SSID is your Wi-Fi name. The policy used to just say that, well, you can't use a town name or a city name or a department name as part of it. So you couldn't do, City of Dallas Wi-Fi or Dallas PD Wi-Fi, for example, as your SSID name. And so that was why we oftentimes saw pretty silly Wi-Fi names, Daffy Duck, that kind of stuff, Tweety Bird. And so now the new policy really is that you just shouldn't broadcast them at all. You should make them invisible to where if somebody just pulls up in your parking lot and pulls up their phone and look for available Wi-Fi networks nearby, they should not see anything relative to your municipality. Especially your police department that's available. It's one thing to make a guest network available, but they should not see the staff or the internal or the police department specific Wi-Fi available to even connect to, which means you have to know what the name is ahead of time before you attempt to connect to it. Any questions before I move on?
We are way ahead of agenda, so if anyone wanted to actually unmute and ask questions, that's fine as well. Just wanted to offer it up for these last couple of slides here since it's such detailed information.
Yep, I don't want to do information overload, but happy to go deeper if anybody has questions.
And I'll keep monitoring chat.
Everybody's eating too, so
True.
I picked the right time to present. So the Public Information Act, or Texas Public Information Act, it just calls out that you do have certain responsibilities with how you should comply with an open records request from a citizen. And at a minimum, you're supposed to provide a cost estimate for producing those records. So if there's a cost to print them, you have to provide that to the within 10 days. To let them know the requester what those next steps are. And then you can also consult with the Attorney General to find out if you can withhold all or some of the requested information. But there also may be some responsibilities there about redacting the information to protect, certain stuff that shouldn't be shared. So you are on the hook, which means that you have to have some infrastructure in place to be able to fulfill those requests, which I think we talk about on the next slide. Yep. So most of it's around email, oftentimes. So if you get into a politically charged situation, or if there's some sort of legal dispute, somebody may come to you and say, okay, I need to know, I need a copy of all emails that were sent between somebody on your staff and, let's say, a particular third-party contractor, in case there was some sort of a dispute there, and you legally have to be able to produce those emails in a format that can be readily viewed by anybody. So it's not supposed to be like a proprietary format that requires any sort of special software in order for the requester to be able to view that information. So it's got to be something fairly ubiquitous, like a PDF file or a text file that they can see. And that includes the attachment. So what that means is that typically you're going to need something beyond Microsoft 365 in order to fulfill that request. Microsoft does have the e-discovery tool that allows you to go in and do the searches and compile the information, but it's pretty crude. It's very tedious. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody say anything positive about the experience of using it, other than, yes, it is there. So technically you check the box that you're compliant with that, but it's a major pain. It's a drain on your resources. So oftentimes people choose to use third-party email archiving apps. The reason you need that compliant email archiving, and what that compliant means, is that you've got to be able to prove that you can store the emails and that you can protect them from being tampered with. So even if somebody goes through and try to hide their tracks and delete emails, you've got to have a separate archive that you can go through and find it anyway. So any email that came into or left your tenant was sent from your Microsoft tenant or email tenant, you need to be able to provide proof of that, including all the attachments. So really what that means is that your records officer or compliance officer needs some sort of access that they can go through and do a search, similar to doing a web search or a Google search, that they can go through and find those emails. They can restrict that search to maybe a certain time period. They can exclude certain search results. So that's really what separates some of these various archiving tools, the good ones from the not so good ones, is the ease with which people can get in there, do the search that they need, just find the information that they're looking for, and not, hundreds or even thousands of other emails that they don't care about. For example, duplicates is a great example of that. And then they need the ability to export that information and also redact it. So if there's credit card numbers, if there's, personally identifiable information in there, social security numbers, or anything that might be a security risk to an individual or to the organization, you've got to be able to redact that information. And then you've got to, Erica, thank you for chiming in. You were the one I had in mind. But you've got to be able to provide that information in a what we call a flattened format, to where people can see that, print it, do whatever they want to do with it, and do that in a timely manner. So there's a huge difference between the good tools and the not so good tools when it comes to email archiving. But Microsoft alone doesn't keep you compliant on that. You've got to, for example, if you wanted to rely on Microsoft to do that, it would generally require that you have an active Microsoft license for that user. That's even for people who've left. So that can get pretty costly pretty fast. So it's really a good idea to look at third-party archiving tools.
And Ryan, I'll chime in on that. If anybody is looking for a solution and would like kind of a list of criteria that we would use to pick a solution, we'd be happy to provide that to anybody. So just let us know.
So when it comes to social media, this is becoming a growing demand to be able to capture this type of content as well, especially for the official social media accounts or any social media posting that's happening from a town or city issued device. So most of the email archiving tools also offer modules that will capture your social media posts. That could be everything from X or Twitter to Instagram to Facebook, LinkedIn, any of those apps. So, and that may also include mobile devices as well as computers. So you really need to be able to capture that. And it's the same thing again. You've got to be able to prove that you've got it all, that you can keep it for an indeterminate amount of time, that it's tamper proof so people can't go through and edit or delete things to cover their tracks after the fact. You've got to be able to search it and then be able to export it in a format that you can share it with other people. Um, so yeah, it's becoming, I think a lot of people are afraid to even go down this road because of the disruption it might create, but it's coming. And so we have to prepare ourselves to be able to make sure we have the tools in place to be able to comply with this requirement. Same goes for the next slide, talking about texting. So, you've got to have mobile device management in place to be able to regulate any devices that you do issue as an organization. So if you're paying the bill for the device and handing it to somebody, you've got to be able to prove that you can get the text, SMS, and chat messages. They're considered public record. And you've got to be able to comply with those same requirements. And that is, you've got to be able to keep them. You got to be able to prove they're not being deleted, and you can produce them and export them and redact them.
And the tougher thing now is that it includes other kinds of chat as well, things like WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger or other ways that people may want to communicate with you.
And really, when you start talking about mobile devices, that's when you have to get into a conversation of, okay, well, how are we going to manage these things? How can we make sure that we're enforcing, restricting TikTok, for example, to make sure that's not getting put into any of our devices, that we're limiting people's ability to go to websites where maybe we don't want them to go, or load apps we don't want them to load. So that really opens up the door to a mobile device management conversation. So then you're talking about things like Microsoft's Entra ID or Microsoft Intune to be able to do that. Or there's a whole host of other ways to be able to accomplish that. But most people, it seems like today, are going down the Microsoft path just because it's so ubiquitous. So credit cards, most of the companies or cities and towns that I support, they take some form of credit card payments for, whether it be for a ticket or for a utility bill or a fine or whatever the case may be. So they've all got credit card machines up at the front window where they can take those payments. So that does mean that you need to be PCI compliant. Most of the agencies that I support do not store the credit card information on premise. They usually partner with some other company that processes the credit card payments for them. So they really just have those credit card terminals connected to a computer or even directly to the network that talk to the cloud, some sort of cloud hosted system. So if you have a credit card processor like that you work with, they will help you maintain your PCI compliance. But what's required of you as the organization is to complete the self-assessment questionnaire once per year. Usually it's pretty simple. Usually the questionnaire amounts to, for the most questions, you say, I don't store this stuff on premise. I don't have any servers where this is saved. I partner with a third party. So it's fairly painless, relatively speaking, compared to like a CGIS audit, but you are required to do it and have that on file. And again, your credit card processor should be able to help you with that process. But it really helps you also understand and map out, just for your own purposes, how you collect credit card payments. Are they virtual terminals or physical? Do you take information over the phone? What do you do payments on your website? If so, who's running that for you? So it does open up the opportunity for you to go down some of those rabbit holes and really make sure you understand how you're doing that to make sure you're compliant with PCI. And then just make sure that you have those written policies. So that does seem to be across the board a renewed point of emphasis from everybody, from service providers to cyber insurance carriers and people like that, is that they're making sure it's one thing to say you have a policy, it's another thing to have it written down and readily available, and that you review it with all of your staff to make sure they're familiar with it. And it's also a good idea to work with your network administrator to segment your networks, to make sure that using things like virtual LANs or VLANs to put these types of devices and sort of segregate them from the rest of your network to reduce the surface attack area that you have, and also reduce the surface for required network scans to make sure that you're compliant in those areas.
Yeah, it's easier to get a, specific VLAN compliant versus an entire network for sure.
Yep. Simplify things, make it easy on yourself, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Then when it comes to HIPAA, local government agencies could be considered a covered entity. So if you provide healthcare services or sponsor health coverage, so you are considered a covered entity under there. So it's just important for you to understand, okay, what are you required to do in terms of HIPAA compliance? And then, of course, HR departments, they have to follow the HIPAA rules in protecting that PHI, the protected health information. And then it's just highly recommended to have your HR personnel take some sort of HIPAA training annually. And most cybersecurity training portals, I know ours does, it also offers some HIPAA compliant training. So it's kind of nice to have that all under one roof, so to speak, or at one portal where you can track them all together. So that's how we approach it, is all of the HIPAA training, all of the CGIS training. We have all of that stuff under one roof, and so you can track that all in one place rather than having it scattered amongst multiple portals or multiple vendors. I think the next one, yep, Q&A. Felt
I
like I
think
went too fast. I hope I didn't go too fast.
also have some other resources here that I'll reorganize this slide, but that's got some of the things that we talked about today. So we'll come back to that. So
Any questions for me? Like I said, Erica, no heckling.
thank you, Angie. So Jeremy, anything else that you can think of that we should be talking about in more in depth?
I was hoping to have some of the attendees just chime in on stuff.
Okay.
I remember calling some healthcare entities actually over COVID, and they were thinking perhaps HIPAA was going to be rather lax during the COVID period, but they were concerned about the after COVID period and what was going to happen with HIPAA. And I don't know if that applies the same here, but based on the assumption that they only have so many human resources to come around and do these checks, it just makes me wonder, what cities need to be ready for the next one.
Got it. Yeah.
Here we go.
Erica was asking, do we have many cities that used apps for tracking the texting? And that's the thing about uh, it's still relatively new, but we're having those conversations more now than we ever have. So the problem is that when people are using their personal devices, it's much harder, right? So having, if it's on a corporate owned device, or if it's all iPhones that are corporate owned, government owned, then it's a lot easier. But it definitely takes some work to get that there. So yeah, and Angie said since they can't track WhatsApp on their archiver, they stayed away from that. So. And Daniel says, what about work being done on personal devices? So does any work need to have capture ability on those phones, iPads, etc.? So Daniel, if it's email, that's automatically going to be captured if you have an email archiving solution in place, because the email archiving uses a functionality called journaling. So any email that flows through the email server a copy of it's going to be placed into the archive, and that'll be set up in an unalterable format. So other things, like if you're doing a social media post or other things, if you're doing it at the at the organizational level, it's real easy to connect an organizational's level or an organization's, LinkedIn or Facebook profiles to an archiving solution, right? That's relatively low cost and it's easy, but personal stuff is where it gets a little trickier. So, does anyone have a policy that employees cannot use their personal devices? Ryan, anything there?
It's a touchy subject, I can tell you that. Some of it depends on how you interpret the Freedom of Information Act and the regulations in that. If somebody's using their personal phone for government related services, so if they're checking their email on it, does it become subject to an open records request? Might they have to surrender that phone in a certain situation? And a lot of people they're afraid to even ask the question because they don't want to know the answer. So I think a lot of people are making it voluntary. For example, multi-factor authentication. If you load the Duo app on your phone, does that mean that you might have to surrender it in an open records request or not? And so that's why some cities are choosing to go with the physical tokens. So it's a bit of a gray area right now. I think if you go by the letter of the law, if you're using your personal device for government purposes, it does become searchable. It does become subject to the open records request, I think is the letter of the law. And so a lot of people don't want to go down that path, and why it's sometimes better to have for you as the organization to issue those devices. Therefore, you own them and you can dictate the rules, and it's a much clearer understanding, but obviously that costs money. So very long answer to a short question, but I hope I answered it.
Yeah, I think that's going to be continue to be a challenge, because I think, Ryan, I think what we've seen is that local government agencies don't want to issue cell phones to everybody because it's very expensive, right?
Yeah.
So, but if they're using their personal devices, those personal devices could be called in to be, data retrieved in the event of an open records or some other type of scenario. So,
Yeah. And a recent example I had was a newly elected council member um, refused to use her personal phone for any purposes relative to that position. And therefore, she wouldn't even accept a phone call because we have their email environment protected with multi-factor authentication. So she would not accept a phone call to even just press one as the form of MFA. And she certainly wasn't going to load the Duo app on her phone. And so we really reached an impasse of, well, we're not going to make an exception for security reasons to allow you to check the email. And if you aren't going to comply with the requirement, then I guess you don't get to check your email. That's pretty much what it runs down to. So it's becoming more and more of an issue because people are more aware of the fact that they might have to surrender their personal device and they don't want to go down that path. But at the same time, we have security restrictions in place for cybersecurity purposes that require the use of a mobile device. So you can kind of reach a stalemate in some cases, and it's not fun.
what else? Any other final questions before we wrap up? All right. Well, let's turn it back over to Jeremy for a wrap up.
Yeah, and for those that were asking about texting and messaging, Chad shared that they utilize, I think it's Evertel by Genesis. It helps them comply with open records and CJIS matters.
The
But
tool
once
that we
again,
offer,
go ahead.
Jaytheon, will also do that. So yeah, there's a number of ways that you can capture those for sure.
Well, again, thank you, everyone. We appreciate you. We had a good turnout, and I appreciate everyone sticking in there and asking questions in the end. If there's anything that you'd like to have a more detailed conversation with, reach out to us. I'll be reaching out to you as well. And thank you for coming. And I hope everyone stays safe out there and has a successful 2025.
Thanks, everybody.